I reel when I think that it's only 21 days away. In 3 weeks' time, you and I will be here in this church celebrating our Lord's resurrection. By then we will have followed him into the city of Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. We would have had all those somber feelings that accompany Good Friday. And we would have moved beyond that to the ultimate, the glory and the triumph of the empty tomb. You will not see any flowers in church during this period. It's just our way of emphasizing that this is a serious walk that we are on. We'll make up for that on Easter Sunday, when there will be bursts of color here in the sanctuary. You will also have noticed it's now quite imposing, this cross making its movement towards the front of the church. He needs to make it big and bulky so that no one can ignore it. So that we can't ever pretend that it never happened. On Good Friday, the 18th of April, the cross will be placed right in the center here on stage. And we will have to deal with its reality and what it means to us as the church. Last week we changed gear a little bit, and I, against my own will, conducted 2 healing services. I don't know if anybody understands how close I got the night before to cancelling everything. At about 11 p.m. I wanted to phone Stella, who is head of my prayer ministry. I wanted to phone Stella and say to her, Auntie Stells, she's old so I call her Auntie. Auntie Stells, you know what, cancel everything. Phone your team, let them know the services are just going to be as per usual. Put away the holy oil that you have acquired. I just want to do the normal stuff. At 11 p.m., my mind was playing games with me last Saturday night, and I said to myself, or whoever said to me, you know what, Bevan, it's never going to work. This is a traditional church, and your congregation is conservative. Why rock the boat? Things are quite cozy on a Sunday morning. Just stick to what you know. But of course, the Holy Spirit's voice couldn't be ignored. And he nagged me until the wee hours of last Sunday morning. And I knew beyond a shadow of any doubt that I had to obey. And so I did. 40 people came up at the 8 o'clock service. 40. And 60 at 10. I was stunned. Firstly, a bit disappointed in my own faithlessness. Might as well admit that here, right? But I was also stunned by God's faithfulness. For you see, God is exactly who He says He is. And He never lets down those who walk in obedience and in faith. I had to drive to Somerset West because Mom was waiting for me for lunch, and I wish I didn't have to do that because my head was spinning as I drove away from church, not quite being able to make sense of what had just happened. And I arrived in Somerset West very emotional, thinking that things are happening here at United Church. Wonderful things, and that long-standing walls are after all coming down. And here we are already on the following Sunday, and I still don't quite know what to say. What I think I should say is something to this effect. Praise be to our God. And secondly, thank you for heeding getting the nudge that came to you. I kind of half said to you that I would not take it personally if no one comes to the front, that I wouldn't be offended. But you know what, I'm only human. I probably would have felt a little bit not so lekker. But I had given that moment to God, and the miraculous took place right here in this building. I trust that as the Lord leads us and as we grow closer and closer to Jesus, that we will see much more abundant anointing coming down on us as the waiting people of God. We are meandering through Mark. We are digging quite deep into the first gospel that we have in our New Testament. And no, I'm not making a mistake when I say that. I know that the New Testament opens with the Gospel of Matthew. I'm talking chronologically, okay? We've got the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest of the Gospels in our New Testament. That's why I wanted us to study it. That's why I wanted us to reflect on its material, and that's why I wanted us to meditate quite deeply on its meaning for us and our lives. For although the document is 2,000 years old, it still has great value for our lives, and its message stands powerfully even 2 millennia on. And I trust that as we continue to learn, that we are discovering things about who Jesus is, and of course also who He has called us to be. Whenever I give you historical stuff about when Mark was written, how it was written, even why it was written, it's not only me trying to sound clever, it is to grow you and to help you find a plan of spiritual enhancement for your own life. And I hope that this Lenten journey has been one of meaning and blessing for all of us as the people of God at United. Last week we looked at the miracles, of course, and all the healings that Mark writes about. This coming Wednesday at our lecture, I'm going to unpack the demon-possessed man in Mark chapter 5. But today there is this beautiful story that we cannot miss out on. The story of Jesus calming the storm. It is found in Mark 4, as from verse 35. That day, when evening came, Jesus said to His disciples. What does the word disciple mean? You're never going to get that wrong ever again, eh? So in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and in part of Acts, they are referred to as disciples, which means learners. And after that, they are spoken of as apostles, which comes from which Greek word? Apostolos, which means being sent out with a specific message. Here they are still known as disciples. So Jesus is speaking to His learners, saying, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along just as He was in the boat. There were also other boats with Him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke Him and said to Him, Teacher, don't you care that we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to His disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who the heck is this? Even the wind, even the waves listen when He speaks. So now I've only got 20 minutes to go, so I better jump right in. What do we learn from this passage? I suppose one could argue that it speaks for itself. The heading is quite nice. Jesus calms the storm. Even that little line, one could get 3 at the push 4 sermons out of. But of course, I looked at the passage with a magnifying glass because I needed to discern what the Lord wants me to bring to you on this cool Sunday morning. The first thing that I noticed in the passage caught me a little bit unawares. I'm not even sure if you noticed this tidbit of detail that Mark thought of including. Matthew doesn't mention it when he writes about the calming of the storm, and neither does the other synoptic author, namely Luke. Only Mark mentions it. What am I talking about? It's something that you will easily not notice unless you pay attention. Which you did, right, when I was reading? Debs, sit gou 'n bietjie op daar vir ons. Jesus was asleep in the stern on a cushion. Now, I can't tell you how often through the years I have preached on this exquisite passage, but never before have I noticed this little bit of info which only Mark bothers to mention. The fact that while Jesus was having a power nap below deck, it was happening on a cushion. That line doesn't appear in Matthew or in Luke. So the question we need to ask is, why is it there? For me, the answer is quite obvious, particularly now that we've made a study of Mark and what he tries to do. What does Mark go out of his way attempting to emphasize in his material? The 2 points we covered on Wednesday. Constantly in Mark, there is the divine Jesus, the Son of God, the deity, but also Mark stresses to quite an extreme extent the humanity of Jesus. And I always give a huge sigh of relief when a gospel author does that, because they then give us a real Jesus. You see, some churches emphasize by far the divinity of Jesus. And that person then becomes almost inaccessible to the ordinary worshipper. And I don't want us to ever fall into that trap. A human Jesus is accessible, approachable, and relatable too. And that is why I am so deeply moved by Mark giving us these little bits of info all the time, pulling out the humanity of Jesus, so that we don't forget that there was a time where he was one of us. The fact that he needed a pillow when he caught his 40 winks speaks volumes of his humanity. And so we can never forget that concept. Of course, he is the object of our adoration and service. And of course, we know that he now sits at the right hand of God, from where he rules and reigns over the entire universe as sovereign and as Savior. But can we really afford to forget that there was once this master plan that God came up with and then got away with by cramming himself into the helpless body of a baby, and then visited this planet in human form? The fact that Jesus was human makes him understandable to us. We can identify with him, for he would have had a body just like ours. A body that got hungry and thirsty and tired. Emotions that got frustrated and angry even in some heated moments. John in particular, in his gospel that was written quite a bit later, towards the end of that first century, John's gospel also makes a big fuss of the humanity of Jesus, because by the time that he was writing, there were some heretical teachings doing their rounds of people claiming that Jesus had been only an appearance, that Jesus had been only an apparition, but that he had had no physical body. So 60 years after the ascension, there was this whole movement of saying that Jesus wasn't or hadn't been real. That Jesus had been a ghost, a spirit at best, visible, but with no bodily form. And so when John, in John chapter 4, talks about how Jesus was resting as he was leaning against the well of Jacob before the Samaritan woman arrives, that was John saying, take note everybody, Jesus could also get tired. In other words, he was human. And when John gives us that dramatic account of how one of the Roman soldiers stabs Jesus in his side to check whether he was dead or not, blood and water came out. That was to address the false teaching that was being spoken at the time by a group of people that denied the fact that Jesus had a physical body of flesh and blood. And so this cute little bit of detail is there for a purpose. That Jesus had a real head, which actually needed a real bow. Mark doesn't only give us that one record of trying to bring home to the reader that Jesus was at the same time fully divine and fully human. And if we battle to understand it, that's supposed to be the case. It's supposed to make no sense to our limited human brains. Mark also says something extremely comforting about Jesus in chapter 9. It's where Jesus uses the example of a child to prove a point when it comes to kingdom living. Jesus says to a child, okay, you stand here, I want my disciples to have a good look at you. And then Jesus says, everybody who says that they follow me, use a child as an example of what I need for you to be a kingdom person. In other words, innocent, simple-minded, sincere, uncomplicated, and unsophisticated. All three Gospels amongst the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, gives us that story of how Jesus used a child to teach a kingdom truth. But only Mark, believe it or not, tells us that Jesus picked the child up. Whether it was a boy or a girl, we don't know. That Jesus went as far as picking the child up and holding him or her in his arms. Once again, a very endearing little bit of detail that the others didn't think necessary to include. But Mark seemingly goes out of his way again and again, creating this figure of Jesus. Somebody you could actually get close to and have a true conversation with. The fact that Jesus understands our human weaknesses, our human limitations, and our human frailty should give us great reassurance. For he became one of us so that he could save us from ourselves. He needed to come and taste the human condition, to pay the price, and to take us home. Sometimes this is a very unsettling concept. The fact that Jesus, actually had elbows. The fact that Jesus could get a cold or a light flu. That Jesus, maybe in his teenage years, had acne. Or dare I say, and I have a feeling that I'm going to get into trouble for this, but it's to drive home a point, okay? That Jesus, even after a meal, could have burped. And I don't say that irreverently or disrespectfully. It is for us to realize the extreme measure that God has gone to bring us back to Himself. He wanted to taste our humanity in the rawest way possible. He wanted to identify with all we are and all we do. There's another place in which Mark tells us something that the others don't. And that is in Mark chapter 9, where Jesus and His disciples are on their way to Jerusalem one last time. They were moving south, going through the city of Jericho. Jericho was their last stop. Mark chapter, 10, I suppose. From there they would move on to Jerusalem, and from there would be the horrific and agonizing crucifixion. Mark tells us that as they were walking along, somewhere between Jericho and Jerusalem, that Jesus was moving ahead of the disciples. Matthew doesn't say that, and neither does Luke. But Mark is trying to create in our minds this desperate figure alone on his dead march. And so there was Jesus taking the lead with his disciples slightly behind him, a meter or two. And of course Mark didn't have to mention that, but it matters to us, for it makes Jesus more accessible to us, more approachable, somebody we can relate to. There he was, knowing what was ahead of him. He knew what the future held. He had to face alone. And that bit of imagery changes everything. That as time was ticking through the hourglass, Jesus would face the cross and all its horror by himself. So I'm very grateful to Mark that he gives us a different approach, if you like, that he takes a different slant, and that he gives us a very human Jesus. For a human Jesus means that he understands our shortcomings, right? And that he understands the battles we fight. And that he understands the tears we cry at night. And that he understands the fears that paralyze us for the future. He shared our life so that he could save us from what we've done to ourselves. And so now you and I don't have destruction as our destiny, but an eternity with him. All that because he became one of us. The second thing that I've picked up, now I'm only going to preach if people are into it. Okay, I don't want to force anything on you. How are we doing? Okay, there's one thumbs up. That has turned the corner. Okay. I don't know if you noticed this bit. You didn't know the pillow thing. So maybe you also didn't notice this thing. But this is a bit more in your face than the pillow thing, okay? The disciples are quite upset and paranoid, or in a word, scared out of their minds. They realize that there could be one solution to this whole situation, and that is to get Jesus on board. Excuse the pun. And so they disturbed Jesus from his sleep, where he was taking a power nap in the stern of the boat, and they shouted at him, trying to be louder than the winds and the waves, saying, "Jesus, don't you care that we perish?" There was no time for Jesus to give some kind of classical answer to that question that he had been posed. He had to rush upstairs to address the winds and the waves, which he of course duly did. He got rid of the storm fast and furiously. Excuse the pun. But here's the bit that I want us to concentrate on. The bit which says that the disciples basically accuse Jesus of not caring. Some of those men were, of course, former fishermen. So they would have been a bit abrupt, a bit brazen. No etiquette, no bedside manner, no softly shaking at Jesus to try and get him to wake up. No, it looks like they arrived at the bottom of the boat, shooting from the hip, with all guns blazing. "Jesus, why do you not care that we are perishing?" And before we make too harsh a judgment on the disciples, perhaps we need to do some introspection. For I don't know about you, but I often enter that wobbly space where I make Jesus, the one I love the most, my punching bag. Where I shove my index finger right into his face and say to him, "You said you cared. What happened in the meantime?" The disciples, I think, should have known better by this time. This wasn't their first day with Jesus. They had seen him in action. Last week, when we looked at those healings that Jesus had performed, they were there. They saw some of those supernatural miracles firsthand. So they should have known in their heart of hearts that Jesus does care. And that Jesus' heart is a kind place. They conveniently forgot about how they had seen that evil spirit being driven out of the man in the synagogue. Mark chapter 2. They had conveniently forgotten about how Jesus had touched a leper and made him whole. They even forgot about those dramatics that took place on the Sabbath when Jesus restored somebody's withered hand on the Sabbath of all things. All of that they had been partied to. They had seen it as witnesses, personally and intimately. But here, as the storm broke out, they fell back into their old habit, that of finding somebody else to blame. Of course, it wasn't the first time ever that somebody treated God so unfairly. Scripture is littered with characters who pointed a finger at God, holding him responsible for their fate. In Psalm chapter 13, Psalm 13, in Psalm 13, the author says, How long, Lord, are you going to forget me for? How long is this Cold War going to be in place between us? Because it certainly feels to me like you are forgetting all about my existence. How long are you going to forget me for? Forever? Then we have guys like Job. Job in the Old Testament. It is the oldest part of the Old Testament. It's about 5,000 years old. So what we have in the story of Job is a very primitive idea of how people believed back then. And Job, of course, also said to God, please don't be offended by what I've got to say, because I feel very pressed to say it. You're a problem to me, because you have allowed this to happen. You are the one behind the mess in my life. Even somebody who should have been wiser and more informed should have known better. Like Jeremiah, for instance, a prophet called at a crucial time in the nation's history, a man of God, respected in the community. Even Jeremiah had an issue with how things had worked out for him. He spoke at the time when God's people were being dragged to the east into Babylonian captivity, and Jeremiah just couldn't get his mind around it. And so Jeremiah said, you know what, Lord? There's just one way of interpreting this. This is your fault. Your people's sorrow, your people's suffering, your people's struggle. It's all because of you, God. Then I can also talk about other giants in the Old Testament who also went through iffy periods, like Elijah, for instance. Who can ever forget the incident of the broom tree? Let's call it that for now. It looks like the disciples tried their best to believe. I'll give them that. But their circumstances were so critical. Their circumstances were so desperate. They were honestly convinced that they weren't going to make it through the night. And I'm willing to tweak my opinion that that is what got to their minds during that storm. That they were so fearful, that they were so scared out of their minds, that is why they went to that place of accusing Jesus. And sometimes the situations that you and I face do that to us. They mess with our minds. And sometimes things that we would never say, things that we would never think or believe, come to the fore in our lives. They surface from deep within. And then our faithful and loving God ends up being the victim of our abuse. The punching bag we want to hit in the face, saying, for it's the easiest thing out to do. Lord, this is your fault. Meanwhile, all that he's ever tried to do was to make our lives work out. Luckily for us, he can take the punches. He's used to it by now. Here's the point I'm trying to drive home to you. Don't let what you are going through make you forget who he is. For a fleeting moment, the disciples had fallen into that awful trap. Don't let it happen to you. When you are in such a tight spot, when you are writhing in pain, when you are being swallowed up by doubt or uncertainty or by fear for the future, don't fall into that trap where you point a finger at God and say, this is all you're doing. For nothing can be further from the truth. Ask the man hanging on the center cross whether he cares or not about you. The disciples would soon learn a once and for all lesson about the extent to which Jesus actually cared. In John chapter 10, Jesus refers to himself as the good shepherd. Now that is not caring, then I don't know what is. And then when Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, after his death, try and spin some kind of dirty trick on Jesus, saying in John chapter 11, Jesus, if you had been here, so if you had arrived 4 days earlier when you said you would, Lazarus would never have died. One of them pulled that stunt on Jesus. And then in verse 38 of John chapter 11, it is written there that Jesus, once again deeply moved, approached the grave and got Lazarus out of there. The shortest verse we have in all of the Bible is written in that context. John 11 verse 35, Jesus wept. Now if Jesus didn't care, I ask you with tears in my pale blue eyes, if Jesus didn't care, would he have wept so bitterly? Jesus feels for you, always has and always will. And if you are going through something which is crippling your life right now, I want you to know this in your heart of hearts, that he is right there with you. There's an old hymn in the Methodist hymn book. I can't even remember who wrote it. We don't sing it anymore because no one knows it. But there's one of the verses, I'll look it up if you really want to know. But there's one of the verses which ends with the words, with Christ in my vessel, I can smile at the storm. The last thing that I want to highlight when it comes to Jesus calming the storm is the fact that he, in the end, calms the storm. This would be a stupid sermon. It would be a stupid sermon if I nitpick at little bits of details, trying to sound clever, having seen things that you had never seen before, and then miss the overall message. For the heading of the passage, after all, is Jesus calming the storm. You don't want to know how much time I spent on thinking about the following. Hours and hours of time and energy have gone into what I'm about to tell you. I've been wondering about whether Mark was just wanting to read this passage and interpret Jesus' power over the climate. Was that his only objective? Just to prove that point, that when the weather goes wild, Jesus can calm it. That's the easiest conclusion one can jump to, right? But I have been wondering. Because I cannot resist. I've been wondering if Mark didn't intend a deeper meaning for the passage also. Might be so, we just don't know. Maybe Mark was also after the reader interpreting this passage spiritually. How's that possibility? Of Mark wanting to drive home that Jesus is boss even over the weather and what the weather does. But do you think that Mark was after something more profound even than that? That Mark's second aim for the passage was also to let the reader know that when we find our lives being consumed by stormy weather, that Jesus can calm that also. I'm willing to let my mind go there. That Mark had two truths he wanted to share. Yes, there's the weather thing, which is quite impressive. But how about our spiritual storms? How about the waters that rage angrily inside of us? How about the winds of doubt and uncertainty and worry that blow wild in our lives, so much so that they cause havoc? I want you to hear these ancient words that I believe have not lost their powerful effect. Peace, be still. And if you allow me the slightest chance, then I would like to speak it over you this morning. I don't think that it's safe to say that no one here is experiencing a storm in their life right now. Eh? I don't think we're all okay. I don't think we're all feeling strong and confident. I think that some of you, I don't know what the percentage would be, that some of you would be going through some extremely harrowing things even as we speak. And your storm, and whatever is causing your storm, I want you to bring to Jesus. Whether it is regret or rejection or a disappointment from way back or a sin in your past which is making you churn inside, I want you to bring it to Jesus. And I want you to offer it to Him. And I want you to hear these words like sweet music to wash over your broken soul. The words, peace, child, into the storm. Be still. You've got nothing to lose. I would do it if I were you. It's good to know that Jesus shared our humanity. It's good to know that He can take our punches even when it's incorrect to blame Him for our crises. And it's good to know that He can calm our storms, even the ones that cause us trouble here in our hearts. There's a moral lesson, I say this as I end, there's a moral lesson to take from Jesus' calming of the storm. The lesson would be that God has authority over the things that we cannot control. I want to say that again. God has authority over the things in your life that you cannot control. Go and look your storm in the eye and tell it that it is met its match. Amen.